Thank you.
You're welcome. I like seeing your face. It's been too long.
I picked a nice background so it would not be too busy.
No, it's perfect. I like the horn. It's nice.
Oh, the horn.
Sorry, I got a gin.
That's a Mystic South horn.
It is. So we're at our 4:30. So this is our final official workshop of the day, and we're closing out workshops with our own Mira Selena, who we love, who's going to talk about stuff that she loves. Take it away.
Film. Okay, so there's a lot of things we can talk about when it comes to witches in the movies, American movies specifically. And so I just picked a topic that I thought that I actually have presented at Mystic South. If you've been there, you might have heard it, but I also thought it might be interesting, and we can kind of just do a quick review, highlighting a few of the movies along the way that you might want to go back and watch. But I want to focus on how modern witches, or how real witches, let's say, directly influenced American movies, because that's always a question. Like, why aren't the movies about us, or where are we represented? So I want to pick out a few movies along the long span of American film and television that demonstrate very clearly that the real witches, occultists, had an influence actually on the representation of witches and witchcraft in narrative cinema. So specifically, I want to be clear so you understand, is that my study and my work is in narrative cinema. So we're not talking about documentaries. That's a whole different ballgame. I'm also specifically talking about the American industry. So there are a lot of British films that might fall into this category as well. We're not talking about those. So I want to take everyone back a long time ago when film just started, this is the interesting part that a lot of people don't know, because we all know about the craft and modern stuff. So in the 1800s, when Hollywood started, representation of witches already existed. We all know this. We had the Satanic Witch coming out of traditional Catholicism and medieval Europe. So we had that witch, that representation. We also had the fairy tale witches, mostly fantasy, which derive from fairy tales, okay? Mostly considered fairy tale, fake, fun, silly, a little ominous. Then you had a mixture of the two, the farcical, what I call the farcical witch. She's also fantasy, she wasn't considered real. And actually Shakespeare's three witches are, historians believe they were meant to be this type of farcical witch, a parody of the Catholic fears, okay? So you have sort of that. So those three things were already in our culture when Hollywood started, and that's where they began. That's where Hollywood began, okay? None of those witches were clearly represented in Hollywood in terms of real witchcraft, okay? So they are mostly considered fantasy. In fact, the Satanic Witch was not represented at all. That witch was not considered real anymore. We have these representations going through a uniquely American culture at the time. So the majority of witches were fantasy. They were fake. They were like fairies and creatures that came from childhood imaginations, from the Victorian culture. Witches did not exist. Witchcraft did not exist. This is the late 1800s, early 1900s, as Hollywood is coming online. Okay, but what's interesting about that, and where we get back to how real witches affected film, this is the same time that spiritualism was becoming popular. This is when the occult was gaining popularity. Okay, like for example, the Ouija board was created at this time. The tarot cards were created at this time. So while witches were considered fake, fantasy, child's play, the occult and spiritualism were really happening, were gaining popularity. So where does this leave us with film? Now, film pretty much treated witchcraft as allegory or as history or as something other than real. However, there are two particular films or two particular influencers that were real practitioners of some sort or related to this topic at that time. Okay, so first we have L. Frank Baum. Most of you know who he is as the writer of The Wizard of Oz. What a lot of people don't realize is he was a spiritualist. Okay, so he's not a witch. However, he was a spiritualist. He was on the records as being part of the Theosophy Society. And he was influenced in that through his mother-in-law. His wife's mother was a big activist. He also was part of many of the progressive movements at the time. So his own beliefs, his own concepts of what witchcraft and magic were written into his books. And if you look at the witches in his written material, you see that witches really don't have a clear, magic isn't clearly bad. It's not evil or good. It just is. It's a tool. Okay. And that's really a revolutionary concept in that day and age. Okay. And it was fantasy. So it was couched in a very Victorian type of feel, his era, but it was there, hidden underneath the surface as child's material. His movies got produced. They weren't produced by him, or at least the main one that survived was not produced by him. So the witches didn't take that on. So it didn't greatly influence film, but it was there and it's notable. Okay, just historically speaking. But more importantly, you had a film or a series, a serial, which is what they were called, that was influenced by Aleister Crowley. And when I say influenced, I mean directly. He was the advisor. The series is called Mysteries of Myra, and you can't watch it. It's a lost film, or at least pieces of it. Most of it's lost. There are pieces that survived. The Mysteries of Myra is about this. It's funny. It's very 1916, 1917. It's about this young, innocent girl, probably a teenager, late teens, whose father was involved with, I think it's called the Black Order. Okay, this secretive occult group, mostly men, who practice this satanic-like, although it's not called satanic, the satanic-like ritual, occult type practice of some sort, and they're after her money. The father was wealthy, he died, he left it all to her, he was a member of the Black Order, so they want the money. So every episode in the serial, they're trying to go after her with some kind of magic, and that she needs to escape. And of course, at this time, she can't escape on her own. She needs somebody to save her, usually a man. So Aleister Crowley was actually the advisor, as I said, along with a spiritualist. And the Black Order, I think what's the high priest of the Black Order, the high wizard, I can't remember what they call him, but he is actually designed specifically on Crowley. And some of the marketing material, you can see the high wizard in similar poses as you would see Aleister Crowley in some of those early photos, very much directly related. So this is really the first instance where you have an occult practitioner of some type directly influencing. L. Frank Baum, he was an indirect influence that really didn't pan out, okay? His philosophies didn't pan out. But Crowley was a direct influencer, similar to what you see much more 100 years later, let's say, with the craft. So he was there, he was on the set, he was actually living in New York State, and the film industry was based in New York and New Jersey at the time. So he was on the set doing this kind of stuff. It's really fun. And it's something that most people don't realize, that Crowley actually was involved in film. So that is the first two influences. But after that, Hollywood went into its golden era, and there was a censorship period. And witches generally, again, are considered silly, not real, they don't exist. Magic is silly, it's something from fantasy, it doesn't exist. So the films from Mysteries of Myra through many of the decades going forward until about 1970 have no influence, no direct influence with magical practitioners that we know of, okay? I always have to add that in because I could not find any influence, not recorded influence. So you have all these spans of movies and all these spans of productions that have little to no influence in any real practitioners. That may not be surprising because it really wasn't until the 60s that magic workers and witches and similar Satanists, etc., all had come out of the broom closet. That's when the movement began. That's when it became public. So it's not surprising that you don't see really direct influence until the early 1970s. After the publication of Buckland's books, after the publication of Paul Huston's book, Mastering Witchcraft, when Anton LaVey became very popular in Hollywood in the late 60s, you have progressive movements. Some of you here probably lived through that time and know exactly what I'm talking about. So this is when you start to see a much more direct influence. Now, that doesn't mean these films were positive reflections of modern witchcraft. They just were using the material that was out there that was real. And you can see that, and I listed a couple films if you want to write them down and look at them. You have a film called Mark of the Witch from 1971. Most of these are horror, I'm going to warn you, and they are not, but you don't have to keep the lights on. They're not terribly scary. But if you look at a movie like Mark of the Witch, 1971, or George Romero's Hungry Witch, which is one of my favorite films from the era, or let's see, those are two that I wrote down. You will notice, you will watch, and you will watch the rituals, you will watch the language and the rhetoric that's exchanged, you will watch all of this, and you will say, wait a minute, I recognize that. If you're a practitioner of witchcraft and you're watching those, you will be able to point it out. That's what they are. A lot of these are borrowing from either magazines, books, but what's very recognizable is Paul Huston's, because Mastering Witchcraft was very influential in these films. And you see it not only in those two, but you also see it in a 1981 teen witchcraft film called Midnight Offerings. And I call that the precursor to The Craft. It has a similar feel, but you see them pulling rituals right out of these books at this point. And these are not the only ones. These are just a couple that are very remarkable. So you see that you hear about the goddess, you hear the language of calling the quarters. This is directly from these books, okay? And on top of that, Paul Huston, just so you know, was actually actively involved in a lot of Hollywood stuff. He actually helped create a 1982 television series called Tucker's Witch. I don't know if anyone's you can't raise your hand, I can't see you, but if anyone remembers a TV show called Tucker's Witch, that was actually created and written by Paul Huston, okay? The author of Mastering Witchcraft. I think that's what he's most recognized for. And so his books and his influence were there. Buckland, allegedly, supposedly, was actually used in several films as a consultant. I do not have proof of that yet. But I do have proof that he was in communication with Hollywood directors and Hollywood studios. So I believe he was another resource that was regularly, oh, that's my son. We're gonna ignore him for now. The other point here during the 70s is that this was also the time that Laurie Cabot was named the Witch of Salem officially, okay, by the city. And so she had I don't know that she had some influence. I haven't found as far as a consultant, and she may have. However, she had an interesting conversation with the producers of Mr. Rogers, which is always fun to note because Mr. Rogers had an episode in which he talks about witchcraft as not being a real thing and witches not being a real thing. This starred Margaret Hamilton, who played the Wicked Witch of the West. He brought her on, and his premise was to keep, to take away the fear from children, the Halloween fear, the fear of witches. And so he said, look, this is just a costume. She's really a person. Witches don't exist. Witchcraft doesn't exist. Magic isn't a real thing. So he does these episodes. Well, Laurie Cabot didn't like it, so she protested. And the show, it didn't help any. The show kept airing. They did reruns through the 1980s. It's a very popular show and a very popular episode. But she was there too, interacting with Hollywood at that point in time. So I'll stop there. Is there any questions? Have any questions popped up that at this point? I know I'm running fast and giving you a lot of information.
Oh, I saw someone, Marion in chat said that her mom recognizes the movie Midnight Offerings. And so far I haven't seen any questions in Facebook chat, but I'll give you a hi sign if I see any come in.
Okay, well, great. Midnight Offerings is, as I said, it's a precursor to the craft. That's the way I like to call it. So if you enjoyed the craft and you want to see something that's similar to that, made in the 1982, but not quite as influential, look at Midnight Offerings. So when you get to the 80s, so we have all this flurry of witchcraft activity, the movement is born, it grows, we start to see a real pagan movement, we see all this activity in a really congealed, we see it influencing Hollywood, everything's going great, alongside all the other social movements going on, and then the 80s happen. So when the Satanic Panic starts, the point that it's actually pigeoned as the point that the Satanic Panic actually starts to affect Hollywood versus when historically it's considered to have started, it's considered to have started in 1983, okay? But we don't see the effects until later. Hollywood's a little behind as far as influence. The most of the 80s, we move out, it's definitely a backlash era. We move out of what we saw in the 70s. So witches stop affecting films. There's no more of that in the 80s, okay? Actually into the Satanic period, the Satanic era of witch films, which is into the 80s and early 90s. Witches aren't doing the work that they did in the 70s. They aren't being called on in the same way. However, there's a few notable points here. Once something happens, it doesn't go back, okay, fully. So in the 80s, we see, like I said, 1981, you got Midnight Offerings and Tucker's Witch. Both had direct influence from the witch community. You also, and I love pointing this out, who watched BJ and the Bear? I can't say that with a straight face. I mean, really. So there's this show, BJ and the Witch, okay? And in BJ and the witch is constructed as an herbalist, a woman who's an herbalist, and she explains how what she does is not evil, it's actually healing and an ancient religion. So where once witchcraft was just imaginary, even though witches were not influencing films and television in the 80s, you start to see that change in the construction. You start to see the influence the modern community is having on film in changing the way Hollywood and television portray witchcraft. Now, it's not across the board, but it's happening. So you have that in, okay, BJ and the Witch. So you want to see that, go back in time, watch a little BJ and the Bear for fun. It's about 45 minutes. You'll enjoy it. And you have to laugh. I mean, really, a monkey driving a truck. How great is that? So then through the 80s, you get a lot of fantasy witches. So we're back to the fantasy stuff. And then, of course, by 1987, 1988, we start to see the backlash from the Satanic Panic. You start to see the evil women, the seductive women who want to tear apart families, who want to eat children. You'll see all of that stuff coming, okay? You have Hocus Pocus, you have the witches, you have Witches of Eastwick. It's just one after the other. Witchcraft, Witchcraft 1, Witchcraft 2, Witchcraft 3, Witchcraft 4. So this is what's going on here. But as I said, the witchcraft community itself was getting bigger, was getting more public, was getting stronger. So in 1991, ABC Productions was staging a series, a television series called The Craft, interestingly enough. And it was going to be about a satanic coven, I believe in New Mexico. I don't know if the original was, the final one was New Mexico, set in New Mexico. that pretty much standard coven stuff, standard satanic coven stuff. They torture women, steal babies, blah, blah, blah. Now, well, there were some witches here in America who were not too happy about that. And pre-internet, they staged a campaign against ABC to stop the show, okay? Led by Selena Fox, the Circle Sanctuary. They had the campaign was a letter writing campaign to the producers at ABC. Were they effective? To an extent. The show was canceled. However, the pilot, which is about 2 hours, was turned into a made-for-TV movie renamed called To Save the Child. Perfect for a satanic era movie. It is about a woman and a man, a young couple, pregnant, who go out to live in New Mexico with his family. Little does she know that her husband and his family are really part of or leaders of a coven. And the unborn child was to become what I like to call the satanic Jesus of the coven. And you see this in a number of films where this child becomes the savior of the witches who are 300 years old, and he's the Messiah. He's their Messiah. So she finds this out. When she does, she's treated horribly until the baby's born, and then when she finds this out, she finally, I won't tell you the end, I won't give you a spoiler, go watch it for yourself, you can see it. Called this To Save a Child. It was an ABC, an ABC made-for-television film. Why it's notable? Is it a great film? No. Why it's notable is because it was produced during that time. It is a perfect example of a satanic panic era witch film, number one. And number two, it's the result of Circle Sanctuary, Selena Fox, and hundreds of American witches protesting over the representation of witchcraft. And what's more interesting is that protest and its success led to the formation of Lady Liberty League. So that was their first event. And after that, Lady Liberty League was born and continued its efforts in a number of areas in the country. So what happened after that? So the satanic panic goes on, right? And by 1994, the FBI and number of Geraldo and everybody says, oh yeah, sorry, we were just joking, or it was a mistake, sorry. And so but it doesn't die down quickly, of course, especially once you get the cultural ball rolling in terms of meaning and representation. It takes a while for it to go away. By 1996, we have the craft. Okay, now the craft really sits at the middle ground between the panic and between what's to come after that. Not only does it have a very satanic panic feel, okay, in terms of teen witch films, we have a devil-like character. We have witches who are selling their soul in their own terms. We have a lot of the language that came out of the satanic panic. However, we also have it meeting real witchcraft. Pat Devin was a COG member, Dianic Witch, was used as a consultant and helped to not only craft the script, but also on set. And she says, and I don't have her direct quotes, but she said the ultimate one was a little disappointing. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than the past. And that's true. One of my favorite scenes in the craft, one of the most realistic scenes in the craft for me in terms of experiencing witchcraft and magic, was the nature scene where they are calling the quarters and the butterflies come down and dance around and the camera twirls around them as that's happening. That for me was the point where I said, that's witchcraft. That's for me where I know that movie had a witch involved, because you can feel in the way the camera works and the way it soars and the way the filmmakers did that scene, you can see there was a witch involved. Not only the words spoken, but the way, the spirit of that sequence, okay? Now we know also from that several of the actresses got involved or were involved in witchcraft or some form of occult practice after that or during. If you look at Rachel True's recent tarot deck and book, she talks about that and how she was interested in pagan type philosophies and concepts and practices before. And the craft seemed to be something that she was just drawn to. And now she actually, like I said, she has a tarot deck out. She's been reading tarot in LA for years. So there's that influence as well. Not only do we have an advisor on the craft, you also have actresses who are actively involved. And as many of you know, and many of you experienced, the craft actually was a catalyst for many people interested in becoming part of it, because the craft was more than just a satanic witch film, even though it still had the residue left. And that was clear in the way it was produced. From that point on, you wound up with more and more shows, either having recognizable members of the witch community participating in consulting on films, or you had people that they weren't giving credit, but they were there, okay? And those would be things like, let me see, Constance Burgess and Charmed and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Blair Witch Project. And you had just a number of these shows, and they were circling around, had advisors, had researchers, and one of the funniest ones actually, and how am I doing on time? I'm not even looking. Okay. One of the funniest ones and the funniest stories, and it's totally anecdotal, I have no proof. It came from the director's comments. A Practical Magic, a movie that lots of witches love to watch, very fun, was supposedly cursed by a witch. It had an advisor on it. I have not been able to discover who it was, but supposedly had a witchcraft advisor. The witchcraft advisor went to the producers, allegedly, supposedly, and said, I want more money, and I want royalties from the film's success. And the producers told her, no way. She had a salary, and that was it. So she stormed out and cursed the film. The director is convinced that the film was cursed because it was not successful. As much as we love the film did not do well, generally speaking. So I thought that's a funny little anecdote that a witch cursed Practical Magic. I don't think the film's cursed. I think it's just a fun film, inconsequential. It's not gonna neither here nor there. We also had The Curse of the Blair Witch Project, or the Blair Witch Project, excuse me. They did a second film called The Curse of the Blair Witch Project, where a Wiccan priest did a mockumentary, was supposedly from a 1971 film called The Mystic Experience. That is a fake. The directors purposely set that up to create the whole mockumentary experience of both their first film, The Blair Witch Project, and The Curse of the Blair Witch Project. So that's really fun to watch as well. What happens in the 2000s? I'm getting closer and closer. This only continues. What we see what happens in the 2000s really is television specifically, more than film, recognizes that not only witches exist and we can't badmouth them, or witches are these hippies doing herb stuff like in BJ and the Bear. Witches actually practice a religion. Okay, so this is really the first time you see that called out. So we have a number of legal and police shows that have episodes during the 2000s that confront religious freedom, religious expression in terms of witchcraft, or with witches, I should say. So you have JAG, the Witches of Gulfport. And you can look at these, you can go back and watch all these episodes. It's fun to go back in time and see some of this fun stuff, especially if you enjoyed the shows. Bones does one called The Witch in the Wardrobe. Boston Legal, The Witches of Mass Destruction. And there's some funny parts of that. That's enjoyable. The Mentalist does a show, Red Rum. And CSI, Book of Shadows. In most of these cases, the witch gets blamed for either a murder or something, and then the police or the lawyers demonstrate that, oh yeah, no, wait, they were just practicing a religion. Wicca, and that's usually Wicca as is the go-to. Wicca is really a religion, and we get a nice explanation about how Wicca is a religion. Now, that all started though, the first ones was with the X-Files. So if you really want to see the beginnings of that, you see that with the X-Files in the 90s, and those 2 episodes to look at would be Santorium, and that one is about a good witch who tries to stop an evil occultist from draining people's blood so he can live forever. Really nice. That's the X-Files, Santorium, and then there's another one called, and it's German, I'm going to mispronounce it, Die Handy Verlitzet, and that's another one, X-Files. And again, you see in those, the X-Files was very before its time doing that, but those 2 shows and then the other ones in the 2000s treat witchcraft as a religion for the first time and defend witches' right to practice that religion. Even if it's a little weird, even it's something that the shows make fun of a little bit, and they do, there is a bit of parody there, but they defend it, okay, in a fair way, in a way that Hollywood had never done before, okay. You see a little of that in, Charmed and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but not, those are still fantasy. This is not fantasy, so you're seeing that. Now, as you get further along into closer to where we are now, most of the shows that are really diving into witchcraft as its center of their narratives have advisors. And have pieces that are recognizable to us as practice, as viable practice. So you have, for example, who I can't see a raise of hands, but who's watching Sabrina or who watched Sabrina, the latest version. Absolutely, most definitely. There's several advisors on that show. Oh, Manny's watching it. I saw a hand. And you can see, and while they're doing the satanic thing, the blend in what they're doing is very different, okay? And they're treating witchcraft in a very unusual way, and its juxtaposition with reality and non-witchcraft is very different. There's some very recognizable things. There's some very satanic-based things that might be a little bit difficult to watch, but there's also stuff going on that is recognizable as witchcraft, okay? As real witchcraft, modern witchcraft. Another one might be the Salem show. The Salem show doesn't have witchcraft practice as we would recognize it. The Salem TV show, what it did was it had advisors, okay, and it was using real witchcraft texts. They were basing it on stuff that was medieval, yes. But what they were doing was very subversive. And so a lot of people rejected that show, but actually what they were doing is they had a very subversive explanation about what witchcraft was underneath. Another show, the new Charm show has advisors on it, and the new Craft, whether you liked it or not, I did not, had advisors. Pam Grossman was one of them, if you've read her book, Waking the Witch. So you're seeing that more and more. We're getting advisors in there. And so more and more you'll watch these movies, watch these episodes of television, and see something you recognize. Oh, wait a minute, I just did that at Samhain. Wait a minute, they're calling the quarters the same way I do. This is something that did not happen for most of Hollywood and television's history. So we're seeing that regularly now. More and more, we have witchcraft writers, we have witchcraft writers. We have writers that are witches openly. We have them as advisors, producers, actors, and that comes through in the films and television. So I sped through that. I sped through 120 plus years, naming some of the shows. Now, keep in mind that, as all of you know, witches and other occultists have been in the closet for many, many years of that time. They did not tell that they practiced or what they believed. So it is possible that any movie we watch might have had a witch involved. However, what I look at is what the end product is and what I'm being told. And for the most part, that has not been the case. So will take questions, or if you don't have questions about, I'm looking at the time, if you don't have questions about what I said, is there a movie or a show you would like to talk about, vent about, or is whatever you want to talk about.
So there were two questions in our chat. The first one from Manny was asking, "What did you think of American Horror Story Coven?"
Okay.
And
Um,
yeah, so
okay, I'll start with that. That, you know what, I have to dive further into it. I only watched 2 or 3 of the episodes, and it's been a while, so it's not fresh in my head. I thought it was very interesting. I thought it was very progressive in a lot of its ways and the way it presented witchcraft. And um, I'm trying. That's sort of what sticks out in my mind about that. I think I think from what I remember, I think the important parts of that particular series, or that was a single season for that particular season of AHS, was the characterization, the various characterizations. In my book, I focused on the one character of, I think her name was Queenie, who was a very different than any other character of that nature. Her size, the racial issues around her, and she was revolutionary in those terms. And so I think that it was the characterizations that were interesting in that show more than anything else. But I can't answer that more than that until I go back and look. It's not fresh in my mind. I hope that gives you something to chew on, Manny.
Yeah, I happen to really like it.
Yeah.
I like the way that it was represented. I mean, there are issues with it. You know, there's the introduction of Papa Legba and all that, but I thought that it was I thought it was very progressive, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
The follow up got weird and satanic, but the initial representation was fun.
Right. It was very challenging. What's interesting about that particular series or season is that it and several other witch films all came out. That was like the beginning. That came out at the very beginning of the third witch cycle of films and television, and it hit hard, and it is very progressive. So yeah, I generally liked it. It's just not one of the ones I focused on recently, so it's out of my mind right now. But yeah, I definitely think it's one of the good ones and one of the markers of this particular era. What's the second one?
So the second one, I'm pretty sure this is from Lady Bridget, asking if you were going to mention the Good Witch series.
I don't talk about the Good Witch series because it's Canadian. So I tend to stay away, and this is important because my study, now I've seen witch films from other eras, or from other countries, but when I did my study, I particularly wanted to stick to American films because it tells me how Americans construct their definition of witchcraft and witches. If you start going outside to other industries, entertainment industries, you get different approaches. And the best way for me to explain that is in Hollywood, films did not have satanic witches until 1960s, 1968. There were a few prior to that, but we had a censorship code that was uniquely American that prevented witches from being in horror films for the most part before 1968, okay? Again, there were a few, but very little. Now, if you go to any other industry, you go to Mexican industry, you go to the Italian industry, you go to the French industry, there were satanic witches in films that whole time that we didn't have them. Okay, and there's a reason for that. Again, we had a censorship system that was uniquely American. They had their own censorship systems, and there's more reasons than that. But that's pretty much the baseline. So if you don't stick within your own entertainment system, you don't get a good, clear look at how your culture or the culture you're studying defines witchcraft and witches. It's so culturally dependent and socially. Religiously, all the elements. It's so dependent upon that you got to stay within your own system. So anyway, that's a long story to why the Good Witch is a Canadian-based production. So I didn't look at it, although Canada's not that different from us, but still, I tried to stay pure.
So there's a comment from Facebook from Martha saying The Last Keepers is terrific, although the ending is rather poor. It was a 2013 film. I didn't know if that was, this is me now asking, I didn't know if that was like an American film or if that was also like Canadian or somewhere else.
I don't know. I didn't focus on The Last Keepers, but I know it's on the list somewhere. But it's I don't remember if it's a Canadian film or not. But it's Disney. I believe The Last Keepers was a Disney film, if I'm remembering correctly. But I did not focus on it, and I don't remember why. So I don't have an answer for that one.
So Marion in chat says the movie Bell Book and Candle, which yes is more fantastical, but it had the part of the witches that had their own underground scene or life that was hidden from the non-witches. Is there anything you can say about that one?
Actually, yeah, that's a really interesting. That's one of the better witch movies of American history. Everybody should watch it. Jimmy Stewart's brilliant. I love him as an actor. But the underground scene, what's really fascinating about Bell Book and Candle, and what not a lot of people might realize, is that the author of the original play was gay, and that the play was written as the witches were written into the play as New York City's gay community. It's codified. It's hidden underneath. Most people who watch the film wouldn't see that. They just see this fanciful witch film with these witches that are underground. But it was written into the play, and the movie may not have been able to express it like a play would have. However, it was there. And it's there in the language if you watch, and I think it wasn't missed. I think people, especially at the time, especially the gay community at the time, would not have missed the cues. They're, like I said, they're written into the actual script. And so that's what that was. Okay, that's what the witch community represented in that play. And that is a layer of meaning in that film that a lot of people miss. Okay, and it makes the film more fascinating, actually, if you know it. And you go watch it again and watch it with that concept. In a lot of movies, witchcraft is is representative of something else. So in this case, that's what it was. And yes, if you go outside of that meaning, the witches in that film, what I call the witches they're the witch next door. They're the witches that it's a fantasy-based setting where there's actually a witch world that lives in amongst reality. And so you have that, I Married a Witch, Bell Book and Candle, Bewitched, Sabrina, you have this a lot. And Bell Book and Candle is one of them. The witches, yeah, like you said, the witches live in regular New York City society, and they have their own subculture. They have a club called the Zodiac, which I don't have proof of, but I would guess that it's based on the famous secretive society, the Zodiac Club, that's been in New York forever. That was not a gay club. That's just a old man's club that's been around. However, they have the Zodiac Club. It doubles as that. They go to it. They hang out. The witches are all fantastical. They have red hair. They wear crazy clothing. They're mischievous. They dance in the streets. They do all this stuff. Nikki Holleroyd, played by Jack Lemmon, is that right? Jack Lemmon is fantastic. It's a really fun film. It has a lot of meaning in it. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but yes, that's Bell Book and Candle and its secret society of witches.
Marianne's nodding yes, so I think it did. There's one more question so far. Have you ever heard of or seen the Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost?
Absolutely. That is, I believe, if I can remember the year, it's probably like 1999, 2001. It was right around there. It's a Scooby-Doo movie. And basically, the band they're Wiccans. So it's one of, if you think back to what I said, is that was right at the time of when Willow becomes Wiccan on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Charmed is out, okay, and they're all Wiccans. And the Blair Witch Project comes out with the Wiccan in The Curse of the Blair Witch, and you would just have all this Wicca, 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 okay, all of this coming out in the late 90s. And so Scooby-Doo, of course, could not let that go. So yes, That's a really fun Scooby-Doo episode. I was a big fan of Scooby-Doo as a child, so of course I've seen Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost.
When my son was very small, he was watching, he was a Scooby-Doo freak. And I'm walking around cleaning behind him one day, and I turn around and all I hear is the Hex sisters turn around and say, "No, we're Wiccans." And I'm like, what? So it always caught my attention.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, this was also the time during this, and this is one of the other brilliant cartoons of our era, is The Simpsons. So you have an episode, and I don't have I remember the name of the episode. It's Rednecks and Broomsticks, or Rednecks, and I can't remember. It's the one where they discover, it's where Lisa discovers a bunch of Wiccans practicing in the woods when her dad is pouring moonshine into the river and getting everybody drunk. So it's a very funny episode, but this is the one where Lisa discovers Wiccans, and the Wiccans are actually the only sane ones in the town, which is fantastic. I love The Simpsons. Anyway, this is when Lisa first discovers it. Eventually Lisa becomes one of them, okay? Then you also have an earlier episode with mocks all of Hollywood's witch tropes and all of Western culture's witch tropes, and that one was called, oh gosh, I can't remember. That one's earlier. It was another Treehouse of Horror. And it's another fantastic one, a little earlier. I can't think of the name of it, the episode right now. But the particular one we're talking about, mentioning Wicca, that's the Rednecks and Broomsticks. I think it's called Rednecks and Broomsticks, after Bedknobs and Broomsticks. So that one is worth a shot. It's the same thing as the Scooby-Doo episode. It's mentioning Wicca. Okay, another question?
Manny has...
I have another question. Do you consider, all right, do you consider The Secrets of Isis as a witch story? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I do not.
The kind of live action Saturday morning, what was it? It was part of like the Shazam hour.
Oh my goodness.
And one of them was The Secret. I see Kasha nodding, so she knows what I'm talking about. But anyway, have a look at The Secrets of Isis. I really am curious what you think about that.
Okay.
And if you want to write an article about it, you know. But actually, so for those of you who don't know, there was a 1970s cartoon. It was like a cartoon crossover, because we talked about Scooby-Doo, and the Secrets of Isis was a live action superhero show, and I think it ran for 2 seasons. And what it is an archaeologist discovers this medallion, and then it turns out that she inherits the magical powers of the priests of Isis, and so she defends justice, and she does all the superhero things, but they're all related. When she intervenes, it's all through incantations and spells and rituals that she does.
Mm-hmm. I'll take a look at it. The problem with my study, with any cultural study, is that you have to draw limits eventually. And so I try to draw limits with the actual show film, defining, using witch at some point within its structure. So just because it has magic in it, spells and incantations or whatever, or it says priestess or has some kind of, doesn't necessarily mean it's defined as a witch film. It's got to have something in it. So that's probably why that one didn't make it into my study, because it probably doesn't necessarily use the word witch, at least in terms of the way I could research it and find it. It may use the word in one of its episodes once, but that's not going to necessarily be recorded. I had some trouble with some of the limitations. For example, the movie Carrie is considered a witch film. The word witch is only used 1 time in that whole film. I kept it in because culturally we see it as a witch film, which is interesting in and of itself. But there are a lot of magical characters and that just don't fit, even though they're magical, and it's hard. You have to draw a line somewhere, otherwise you're watching.
Actually, it wasn't really specifically related to your study. I was just curious whether you had seen the show,
Mhm.
particularly because of the context of the 1970s, where there
Right.
was, you know, Paul Hewson's book had already kind of come out and it had made it, and then it uses the same kind of it uses the structure that we would be very familiar with.
And it may be, that's really interesting. And what I'm hearing though, and you know, I may have seen it because who knows, I don't recall it, but this was also the 70s was a time where we saw a lot of female superheroes. And so we had Wonder Woman at that time, if you think of stuff like that. And that followed through into the early 80s, and it was in a lot of cartoons, you know, She-Ra, and gosh, trying to think of some other ones. Sabrina was a big character then. You had a lot of strong female characters. So yeah, I mean, it may fit into that model as well. So I'll take a look, I definitely will. Any other questions? Bionic Woman, yes, I just saw that. That's another one, yep.
Electra Woman and Dinah Girl, just and
Yeah, it was
Wendy the Good Witch.
Wendy's from the 1940s, and she hung on, didn't she?
Yeah, that's right.
Any other questions? Comments?
I'm looking.
Okay.
That Stacia remembers the show too, so it's not just a shared hallucination with Manny and Kasha.
We
Yeah,
have better
Saturday-
ones.
Saturday morning cartoons in the 70s and 80s were the real thing. I mean, that's what you lived for. I mean, it was like, don't mess with me from like 8 a.m. until noon, because I'm watching cartoons, and an hour and a half of that's going to be the Smurfs. Any other questions? I hope that you guys got a good sense of how, and that's what I wanted to share with you, is how our community, even though most witches are not representative of us, how we as a well, we'd say our movement really just started in the 60s, but modern people that actually practice magic, who believe in magic as a real thing, not a fantasy thing, not a bad thing, influenced how they're represented in Hollywood and television. And it did happen, and it's happening more and more. And one of the questions I get when I talk about this subject is, when is Hollywood going to represent us in real form, the way we actually are? And you can look to documentaries for that. There are some out there, and they've been happening since the 70s, and there's some good ones even in the 80s. However, you know, truth be told, Hollywood and television may never represent us the way we are, as the center of a narrative story, because I'm just going to be frank, we're boring. Just like they don't represent true doctors the way they are, or any other practice, because Hollywood narrative cinema and television narrative cinema is not, it's there to lure you in, it's there to tell you a story. It's going to be dramatic, it's going to be fanciful. You know, an action hero is not real. And so that may not happen in true. There are some good representations. In fact, some of those police shows and those law shows, those are where you're going to find the real representations, because it's embedded within the drama of the greater drama of the show. It's not focused on that. Maybe one day we'll get a good slice of life representation. There is one, there's a terrible movie called the cheerleader, what's the name of it? It's something, How to Kill a Cheerleader, or All Cheerleaders Must Die, okay? And there's a witch in that. It's a terrible movie, okay? So I'm not recommending you watch it unless you really want to. But it has a witch in it who tries to help the other, she's just a girl who's a witch. Okay, so that's the kind of thing we want to look for, is just a person who happens to be a witch, and the practice is normalized. You see that again in those TV shows. The Love Witch, very campy, very fun to watch. That has some good stuff that seems very genuine. That's from 2016, I believe. Okay, Anna Biller's film. It's an independent. Definitely watch that one. You'll see some very recognizable stuff, some stuff that's more modern. She's not a witch, but she did some research and she's pretty legit in terms of that. But are we going to get one that's focused on what we look like and what we do every day? We got to get a little spicier. We got to get a little drama going on, because frankly, we're just like everybody else. And if they come into our homes, they're going to be like, wait a minute, this is not what we expected. We're too boring. I don't find us boring, but Hollywood in terms of narrative cinema might. And that's why we won't see it. But again, that's not any different than doctors, lawyers, the lawyer shows, the TV show, the action dramas. You know, it's not about reality. It's storytelling. So
talking about the cop shows again, Steve said that Jack thinks he remembers an episode of Dragnet that dealt with witchcraft. Do you know if they did?
I don't, but I can find out. I can definitely find out. I didn't see it. It did not come up in any of my searches and research, but I can check it out for him. I'll let him know. But the later TV shows, I think the best places to find representations of what, you know, mostly Wiccans, because that's what they did, were look like in terms of reality, are those TV shows. The ones like specifically Jag, The Mentalist, you know, there is some sensationalism, but some of those have some of the better representations of what we're really like, fighting for religious freedom, just living our lives, raising our kids, mixing our herbs, you know. So there you go. That's a quick and fast overview, and some great questions. If there's no other questions, then you guys can email me anytime with more. And I guess that's it.
It looks like Raven posted in our chat here. She said the Dragnet movie was hilariously awful. The bad guys were a group called Pagans.
Okay. Was he talking about a show or is he talking about the movie?
Well,
I thought he said episode of Dragnet.
He said an episode of Dragnet.
Okay, so that's not the movie. Okay. Yeah, I'll check it out. I'll find out. That's funny. The Pagans are also a biker gang too, so we don't own that term. Yeah, the movie was Dan Aykroyd and Tom Hanks. That was more recent. The actual show was what, 50s or 60s, I think. So I thought Jack was talking about the show. So he said series. So I'll take a look and let Jack know. And I do remember seeing the Dragnet movie, but yeah, I don't think I'm going to go back and watch that.
So Heather, if anyone wants to learn more about your research into witches in American cinema and into American media, can you remind me about your book?
Sure. My book is called Bell Book and Camera. And I'm going to have big news coming out about that probably in about a month. So you can get the one that is available now, and that gives you the full overview, not just how witches influence it, but it gives you a whole overview of witches in American cinema and television. And what I like to say is that the way I describe it is the story of the witch, the American cinematic witch, is the story of the American woman. And so really you see that if you read the book and you follow the story and watch some of the films as you go along, I recommend you do that because that makes it way more fun. You will see the story of American women and the fight for gender equality, the evolution of gender politics, as well as religion's influence on the Hollywood cinema and a lot of other things. So I pull in all of that. And our influence is just one piece of the picture of how witches are represented in our entertainment. So yeah, the book is great. It's out. Watch my Facebook page and Twitter for the big announcement coming in January. And you can always find me on Facebook and Twitter and text me questions, a new movie you found that I might have missed, or recommendations for something you want to watch. I can always provide that. Or if you just want to chat about movies, I'm good too.
Hey, thank you so much, Heather. This was really informative, and I saw a lot of really positive comments in our chats about how interesting it was and how insightful it was and how in detail you were able to give for everything. So thank you so much. This was
You're welcome. It was good seeing all the faces I did see and knowing that all you guys are there. I hope you all have a great rest of your turning of the tides and your rituals and whatever you're going to do. Blessed Yule to all of you if you're celebrating, and happy coming of the new year into 2021.
yay!
Bye.
Thank you.